So in this video, we're going to go ahead and create our very first Android application. But the first thing I want to show you is what happens when an update of Android Studio or the Android SDK comes down the internet pipe. So on the screen, you can see that I've got Android Studio opened, and I've got a pop-up on the screen mentioning in the top right-hand corner that the following components are ready to update. And there's an option now that I can click on Update. So generally speaking, I do recommend you always update, and that's because the Android Studio platform, as well as the Android SDK itself, is constantly being fixed, improved, and updated. So when you do see a message like this, to update it, you just click on Update Now. And you'll see that the process will start and it's downloading the relevant things that it needs. Then it'll go ahead and install it. And you may need to restart Android Studio for the changes to take effect. Okay, so you can see that I fast forwarded that to finish it completely. Depending on the speed of your internet connection, and it may take a while to download and then install. So let's move on now to creating our first application. So here we are with Android Studio loaded. Now, if you're on a Mac, which I am, you can either go to the Applications folder and double click on Android Studio, or you can press Command and Space and type in Android Studio. Either way will get Android Studio to start on your computer. And if you're on a Windows machine, you can just go to the Start menu and type Android and then click the icon when it pops up. And on Linux, you can use the technique I showed you in that video to access the Android Studio desktop entry that we created. In any event, start Android Studio as I've done now. And we're going to go ahead and create this project by clicking on Start a New Android Studio Project. Once we do that, it invokes the wizard, which you saw in the previous video when we were going through the templates. And you can see it's asking various pieces of information. The first field it's asking, or first bit of information it's asking for, is the application name. And we're going to keep it simple and call our first application Hello World. I'm going to tab over to the next field. Now this next field can be a little bit confusing, company domain. So you need a bit of background just to make sense of this. Essentially, Android applications use the concept of a package name to make sure that your application reference is unique across the world. Now that's actually a Java convention, and because we're creating our Android app using Java, we get the prompt for a domain to use. Now the reason that it needs to be unique is that when you eventually go to upload your application to the Google Play Android App Store, or indeed any Android App Store, because there are multiple ones available, when you go to make your application available for purchase from other people, that application needs to have a unique identifier that's not used by any other application across the world. So what Google usually suggests you do is come up with a company domain name. Now, in my case, I'm going to use my domain name, and I've got a domain name called timbachauca.com. So instead of timbachauca.example.com, I'm just going to make mine timbachauca.com. And notice as I'm typing, the package name is changing. And you can see what's happened with the package name. Android Studio uses this reverse domain name to create the package. I typed in timbachauca.com, and it came up and said com.timbachauca.helloworld. And obviously you can see that the hello world has come from the application name minus capitalization and also minus spaces. Now you don't need to use this domain. You can use your own domain name if you have one. And if you haven't got a domain name, that's okay. For training and testing purposes, there are a set of example domain names that have been set aside for people to use. Example.com and example.org are two of these example domains. So we can come back here and quite easily change that to example.com or example.org. So feel free to use that, but in my case, I'm going to go ahead and stick with timbachauca.com, as I'll be doing for all projects in this course. Now you can literally have anything in that field, but just do note that once you're creating your own applications and you're at the stage of uploading them to the App Store, you really do want to have your own domain name at that point so that you can make this unique. Example.com won't work at that point in time. So now that we've filled up those two fields, the next thing we need to do is define the location where ultimately we're going to be storing our projects. Now you can see that there's a default location that's come up for me automatically, and you may find that Android Studio will have a default for you. But what I'm going to do is change that default. I'm going to put the projects for this course in another folder. So I'm just going to click on this little ellipse here, which opens up a folder, and I'm going to navigate to the location on my system where I want to save these projects. So in my case, I've created a new folder called Android N, and I'm going to click OK. And that's now the location that I'll be using for all programs in this course. And you can see what's happened is automatically after the Android-N, which is the new folder, Android Studio has appended the name of the project, in this case Hello World, for us automatically. And that means that every time we create a project in this course, there's going to be a separate subdirectory or folder for that project, making it easy for you to navigate and find the right project anytime you need to. So that's the first screen. After you've done that, you click on Next. Now at this point, after you've clicked Next for the very first time, you may find that you get a screen similar to this. And what will happen is Android Studio will need to install supplementary components in order to build your application. So if that does come up, and it may take a short while to download and configure and set things up, just wait until it's finished and then click on Next. You'll then come back to this screen, and this can look rather intimidating the first time you see it. So your first thought might be, what's all this about? Well, firstly, before I start talking about some of these things like minimum SDK, these things here, Wear, TV, Android, Auto, and Glass, these will normally be disabled. And you don't need to enable those for most projects. Now, Wear is Android functionality to run Android applications on things like watches and so forth. In other words, wearable devices. TV, well, this is for Android TV, so you can create applications that work on any TV that is running the Android operating system. Android Auto is for cars, automobiles, literally. Again, it's a special version that runs on that platform so that you can create applications for cars. And last but by no means least is this bottom one, Android Glass, which is Google's technology that enables you to create applications that run on glasses that you can actually put on your face, over your eyes, and so forth. Now, we aren't going to be targeting any of those in this course because to actually do them justice, you'd really need to create a course in its own right to adequately explain them. So we're going to leave all those disabled for all applications we're creating this course. In other words, the checkbox should be off for all of those. But the important thing on the screen right now is this minimum SDK. So what is this? Well, SDK stands for Software Development Kit, and that's the version of the Android operating system and the minimum version that your application is going to run on. Now, if we have a look here, if we select the drop-down, we can see that we can literally go all the way back to the very first version of Android. You can see going right back to Android 1.0, and we've got this concept of an API. And each time a new version comes out, that API number is incremented. So you can see that API 1 was Android 1.0, and as we went through, right up to API N, which is the newer version of Android, but API 23 being Android Marshmallow and so on. So if I go back here and select Android 1.0, you can see by selecting API 1 and later, your app will run on approximately 100% of the devices. Now that's great if you want to fully support every single version of Android, but by adding support for all versions of the Android operating system going right back to version 1, we are limiting ourselves and our application in some of the functionality we can use, and that's because as new versions of the Android operating system have come out, Google have updated them and improved them and added a lot of features. So consequently, it's not recommended in most cases to go back and say that you're going to support that minimum version. It's a bit of a trade-off actually between the percentage of people who can access an older version and the functionality that you want to have in your applications. But as a general rule, I recommend that you set your minimum target version to Android 4.1, being API 16, and that's this one on the screen there. And you can see by selecting that, the applications we're going to create will still run on approximately 95% of Android devices. Now you could go back one if you wanted to, back to an older version still, Ice Cream Sandwich, and target 97.4, but I don't think we need to do that. API 16, I'm pretty comfortable in saying, is the one that you should choose, and we'll pretty well be doing that for all applications in this course as well. And as a summary, what we're saying is that anyone who's running an Android version going back to Android API 16 or higher will be able to run the applications that we create in this course, and that's 95% of users. If they're running an older version prior to API 16, they won't be able to download and run your application. So in general, we're going to be using API 16 throughout this course as our minimum SDK, with the only exception being when I target API 17, because there was a new feature introduced in Android 4.2 that I'd like to use directly rather than trying to be compatible with earlier versions. And incidentally, this ability to set a minimum SDK is why you don't have to install all these older Android versions when we were configuring Android in the SDK Manager in an earlier video. And I'll talk a bit more about compatibility later, but you can see that older SDK levels are available even though you didn't install all those previous versions. So I'm going to click on Next. And at this point, we're going to end the video and we'll continue on with our first application in the next video.